Eleanor Johnson shifted uncomfortably on the hard plastic chair in Chicago O'Hare International Airport, her knees aching after sitting in the same position for nearly an hour. At 78, travel had become increasingly difficult, which is why she had specifically requested wheelchair assistance when booking her flight 3 weeks ago. The large departure hall bustled with activity. Families rushing to gates, business people typing furiously on laptops, and airport staff efficiently moving through the crowd. Everyone seemed to be going somewhere except Eleanor. She watched, as a young man in a suit was immediately offered a wheelchair, despite appearing to have no mobility issues. The same had happened with a blonde woman in her 40s just 15 minutes earlier. Eleanor had already approached the check-in counter twice, where the staff assured her someone would come right away. That was 45 minutes ago. Eleanor adjusted her navy cardigan and straightened her simple pearl necklace. She always dressed properly for air travel, a habit from the days when flying was considered an event. After teaching 3rd grade for over 4 decades, she had developed both patience and persistence, but this situation was testing both qualities. "This is ridiculous," she muttered to herself, using her wooden cane to slowly stand up. The motion sent a sharp pain through her hip, the same hip she'd had replaced last year. The doctor had warned her about sitting too long, but what choice did she have? The departure board showed her flight to Seattle would begin boarding in 20 minutes. Her son had arranged everything perfectly. First-class tickets so she would be comfortable, wheelchair assistance at both airports, and he'd be there to pick her up when she landed. It was supposed to be stress-free. Eleanor made her way slowly toward the gate, pausing every few steps to shift her weight off her painful hip. She noticed a flight attendant with a clipboard standing near the priority boarding lane. The woman's name tag read, Melissa Winters, and she was efficiently checking documents and directing passengers. Eleanor approached, moving slowly but deliberately. "Excuse me, miss," Eleanor said. "I've been waiting for wheelchair assistance for nearly an hour. My flight boards soon, and I'm worried I won't make it to the gate in time." Melissa looked up from her clipboard, her eyes quickly scanning Eleanor, taking in the cane, the simple clothes, the gray hair styled in a practical bob. Something in her expression shifted subtly. "Wheelchair assistance needs to be arranged at the main service desk," she replied, her tone businesslike but cooler than the one Eleanor had heard her use with previous passengers. "I did arrange it 3 weeks ago when I booked the ticket," Eleanor explained, reaching into her purse for her confirmation. "It's noted on my booking. I've been waiting by check-in as instructed, but no one has come." Melissa glanced at the line forming behind Eleanor. "I'm sorry, but assistance is currently unavailable. We're short-staffed today." She gestured vaguely toward the other side of the terminal. "You'll need to continue waiting or make your way to the gate yourself." Eleanor looked in the direction Melissa had pointed and saw 3 empty wheelchairs parked against a wall, with an attendant scrolling through his phone beside them. She turned back, confusion evident on her face. "But there are wheelchairs right there," Eleanor said, pointing with her cane. "And my flight will start boarding soon. I'm in first class." Something flickered across Melissa's face. Surprise, perhaps, or doubt. "First class?" she repeated, as if confirming she'd heard correctly. "Yes," Eleanor nodded, pulling out her boarding pass. "My son arranged everything." Melissa took the boarding pass, studying it with narrowed eyes. Eleanor noticed how the flight attendant's gaze lingered on her name, Eleanor Johnson, and then shifted to the seat assignment. 2A, definitely first class. "I see," Melissa said, her tone shifting slightly. "Well, Ms. Johnson, even first-class passengers need to follow proper procedures. You should have arrived earlier if you knew you needed special accommodation." A few passengers in line had begun to notice the interaction. An older white couple exchanged glances, the woman frowning slightly. A younger man with headphones removed, one earpiece listening more attentively. "I arrived 2 hours early," Eleanor replied, her teacher's voice emerging, calm but firm. "And I followed all the procedures. The confirmation email specifically said to wait at check-in for assistance." Melissa sighed, the sound making it clear she viewed this as an inconvenience. "Let me see what I can do," she said, picking up a phone. She turned away slightly as she made the call, but Eleanor could still hear her. "I have an elderly passenger at gate 23 requesting wheelchair assistance," Melissa said into the phone, her voice low. "Yes, I know it's last minute. She says she requested it in advance. Johnson, Eleanor Johnson." While waiting, Eleanor glanced around and noticed more people watching the interaction. She felt a familiar discomfort, the feeling of being simultaneously visible and invisible that she'd experienced countless times throughout her life. At her age, she was used to it, but that didn't make it any easier. Melissa hung up the phone and turned back to Eleanor. "They'll send someone when available, but they're prioritizing passengers with immediate departures right now." Eleanor checked her watch. "My flight starts boarding in 15 minutes. That seems fairly immediate to me. First class and priority passengers will board first," Melissa responded, not addressing Eleanor's point. "You can wait here, or if assistance doesn't arrive in time, perhaps you can board when we call for passengers needing extra time." Eleanor felt heat rising to her cheeks, not from embarrassment but from a slow-building frustration. This wasn't just poor customer service. There was something else happening here. She'd experienced it enough times in her life to recognize it, even when it came wrapped in polite corporate language. "I have a confirmed assistance request," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite her rising blood pressure. "And I'm a first-class passenger on this flight. I don't understand why this is so difficult." Melissa's smile tightened. "As I said, we're doing our best. If you'd like to speak to a manager, you're welcome to return to the service desk, though that might make you late for boarding." A few passengers behind Eleanor shifted uncomfortably. One woman started to speak up, but then seemed to think better of it. "My son is the pilot of this flight," Eleanor said finally. "Captain Michael Johnson. He arranged this ticket and the assistance. He would be very disappointed to hear about this situation." Melissa's expression changed to one of visible skepticism. "Ma'am," she said, emphasizing the word in a way that made it clear she didn't believe Eleanor. "Everyone has connections, but I still need to follow procedure. If your son really is a pilot, I'm sure he understands how airline protocols work." Eleanor opened her mouth to respond when she caught sight of a familiar figure moving through the terminal in her peripheral vision. She felt a wave of relief wash over her as she recognized the confident stride and broad shoulders of her son, dressed in his captain's uniform, approaching the gate. Eleanor felt her heart beating faster as she tried to maintain her composure. The line behind her had grown, with impatient travelers shifting their weight from one foot to another, some checking their watches, others looking at their phones. Melissa had started helping another passenger, effectively dismissing Eleanor's concerns. "Excuse me," Eleanor said, tapping her cane gently on the floor to get Melissa's attention. "I wasn't finished speaking with you." Melissa looked up, her expression a practiced mix of professional patience stretched thin. "Ms. Johnson, I've explained the situation. I've called for assistance, and you'll need to wait. There's nothing more I can do right now." A young mother with a toddler in line behind Eleanor offered a sympathetic smile. "Would you like my spot in line? You look like you could use a seat," she said, pointing to the nearby chairs. "Thank you, dear, but this isn't about waiting in line. It's about the wheelchair assistance I requested weeks ago that hasn't arrived," Eleanor explained, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Melissa's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing irritation. "Ms. Johnson, raising your voice won't make assistance arrive any faster." "I'm not raising my voice," Eleanor replied evenly. "I'm simply explaining the situation to this kind young woman." An older gentleman in a business suit stepped forward. "I couldn't help overhearing. This lady requested wheelchair assistance and hasn't received it. That seems like a simple problem to solve." Melissa's smile remained fixed in place. "Sir, we're handling the situation. If everyone could please stay in line, we'll begin boarding shortly." Eleanor felt a mix of emotions, frustration at being dismissed, embarrassment at becoming the center of attention, and a familiar weariness. Throughout her life, she'd learned when to push and when to retreat. As a black woman who had lived through the civil rights era, who had been the first person of color to teach at her school in 1968, She'd developed a fine-tuned sense for these situations. "I understand you're busy," Eleanor said, lowering her voice. "But I've been teaching third graders for 43 years, so I recognize when someone is avoiding responsibility. All I'm asking is for the assistance I requested and confirmed 3 separate times." Something in her tone must have resonated with Melissa, whose eyes widened slightly. Before she could respond, a young man in an airport uniform approached. "Are you Eleanor Johnson?" he asked, slightly out of breath. "I'm Tom from Passenger Assistance. Sorry about the wait. There was some confusion about your request." Eleanor nodded, relieved. "Yes, that's me." "Great. I can help you to your gate now." "Your flight is boarding soon, right?" Melissa quickly interjected. "She's already at the correct gate. She's flying with us to Seattle." Tom looked confused. "Oh, I was told to take you to gate 23 for the Seattle flight." "This is gate 23, Eleanor confirmed. "Right," Tom said, scratching his head. "Well, would you like me to help you board when it's time? I can wait with you." Before Eleanor could answer, Melissa spoke again. "We call for pre-boarding for passengers needing extra time. She can board then." Eleanor felt her patience evaporating. "Young man, I requested wheelchair assistance because I cannot stand for extended periods. My hip replacement from last year is still giving me trouble. Standing here arguing about whether I need help is exactly the problem I'm trying to avoid." Several passengers were now openly watching the interaction. The businessman who had spoken up earlier frowned, checking his watch and then looking at Melissa. "It seems like a simple request," he commented. "The lady needs a wheelchair. There are wheelchairs right over there." Melissa's professional demeanor remained intact, but her voice took on an edge. "Sir, we have procedures for a reason. I've already called for assistance." "And I'm here now," Tom said, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "So what would you like me to do?" Eleanor sighed. "I would like to sit down while waiting to board. That's all I've wanted for the past hour." Tom nodded and turned to get a wheelchair from the stack against the wall. As he walked away, Eleanor noticed a commotion near the staff entrance to the jetway. Several flight attendants were greeting someone with notable respect, their postures straightening, smiles becoming more genuine. A tall man in a pilot's uniform was making his way toward the gate desk. Even from a distance, Eleanor recognized her son's walk, confident but unhurried, shoulders back, head high. Michael had always carried himself with dignity, something she had taught him was necessary in a world that would often try to diminish him. She watched as crew members nodded respectfully to him. The co-pilot, a younger man with reddish hair, was talking animatedly while Michael listened with his characteristic focused attention. Eleanor felt a surge of maternal pride, as she always did, seeing her son in his element. Melissa hadn't noticed the captain's arrival, still focused on managing the growing line of passengers while simultaneously handling Eleanor's situation. Tom returned with a wheelchair just as Michael approached the desk from the other side. "Pre-boarding will begin in approximately 10 minutes, Melissa announced to the waiting passengers, her back now to Eleanor. "We'll start with our first-class passengers and those needing extra time." Eleanor was about to speak when she felt a gentle hand on her shoulder. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. "Mom, is everything all right here?" Michael's deep voice carried easily over the terminal noise. Melissa turned at the sound, her professional smile automatically in place until she registered who had spoken. Eleanor watched as recognition dawned on the flight attendant's face. First, seeing the captain's uniform, then noticing the name badge, Captain Johnson, and finally making the connection to Eleanor. "Captain Johnson," Melissa said, her voice suddenly much warmer. "I didn't realize you were already on site." "Just completed the pre-flight checks," Michael replied, his hand still resting protectively on his mother's shoulder. "I wanted to make sure Mom got settled in before the other passengers boarded." He looked down at Eleanor with concern. "Everything okay?" Before Eleanor could answer, Melissa jumped in. "We were just arranging assistance for Ms. Johnson. There seems to have been some confusion with her request." Eleanor met her son's eyes and gave a small shake of her head, their private signal from his childhood when adults weren't telling the whole truth. Michael's expression remained pleasant, but Eleanor noticed the subtle tightening around his eyes. a sign he recognized from raising him. He was angry but controlling it. "Ms. Winters," he said, reading Melissa's name tag. "This is my mother, Eleanor Johnson. She reserved assistance weeks ago for her flight today. Our flight. Is there a problem with that arrangement?" The terminal seemed quiet, though Eleanor knew it was just her focus narrowing to this moment. Nearby passengers were watching with undisguised interest. Tom stood awkwardly beside the wheelchair, looking between Melissa and the captain. Melissa's face flushed. There must have been a miscommunication. I was told assistance was on its way." "It was," Tom confirmed. "I just got the call about 10 minutes ago." Michael nodded slowly. "I see. And Mom has been waiting how long?" "Almost an hour," Eleanor said, keeping her voice level. "I spoke to the check-in counter twice." Passengers in line exchanged glances. The businessman who had spoken up earlier nodded slightly, confirming Eleanor's account. "I'm sure it was just an unfortunate oversight," Michael said, his tone making it clear he didn't believe that for a second. "Tom, would you mind helping my mother board now? I'd like her to get settled comfortably before we begin general boarding." "Of course, Captain," Tom responded, positioning the wheelchair beside Eleanor. As Eleanor carefully lowered herself into the wheelchair, she noticed Melissa's frozen expression, a mixture of embarrassment and realization. The flight attendant opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, seemingly unable to find appropriate words. Eleanor felt no satisfaction in Melissa's discomfort. As a teacher, she had always believed in learning opportunities rather than punishment. This young woman had made assumptions, whether conscious or unconscious, that had affected how she treated an elderly passenger. The revelation that this passenger was the captain's mother had forced her to confront those assumptions. As Tom prepared to wheel her toward the jetway, Eleanor paused and looked up at Melissa. "You know," she said quietly, "my son was raised to treat everyone with the same respect regardless of who they are or who they know. It's not about connections, it's about common decency." Michael Johnson had walked through the busy terminal, with the focused mind of a pilot preparing for flight. He'd already completed his pre-flight checklist, reviewed the weather patterns along their route to Seattle, and briefed his co-pilot on their flight plan. Everything was in order except for one personal matter, making sure his mother was comfortable before takeoff. He'd arranged her trip weeks ago, carefully selecting a morning flight when turbulence would be minimal and booking her a first-class seat with extra legroom for her recovering hip. Most importantly, he'd triple-confirmed the wheelchair assistance she would need at both airports. At 78, his mother still maintained her independence fiercely, but traveling had become increasingly difficult for her. As Michael approached Gate 23, he noticed several crew members engaged in animated conversation. His co-pilot, Robert Chen, was reviewing something on his tablet, while two flight attendants were organizing the beverage cart near the jetway entrance. They all straightened when they saw him, offering respectful nods and greetings. "Captain Johnson, good morning," said Lisa, the head flight attendant. "We're just about ready to begin boarding. All systems are go." "Thank you, Lisa," Michael replied with a nod. "Is everything running on schedule?" "Yes, sir. We should begin boarding. In about 10 minutes, weather conditions are favorable, and we're looking at an on-time departure." "Excellent," Michael said, scanning the waiting area. "I'm just going to check on my mother. She should be here already. Elderly black woman, gray hair, likely with a wheelchair attendant." Lisa looked surprised. "Your mother is on our flight." "Today?" "Yes, heading out to stay with me for a few weeks. I arranged everything with the airline to ensure she'd have assistance." Michael continued looking through the crowd of waiting passengers. "I don't see her with any of the wheelchair attendants, though." Robert glanced up from his tablet. "Is that her over by the desk? The woman with the cane speaking to Melissa?" Michael followed Robert's gaze and immediately recognized his mother. She was leaning on her cane, clearly tired from standing while engaged in what appeared to be a tense conversation with a flight attendant. His mother's posture was rigid, a sign she was frustrated but maintaining her dignity, something he'd seen countless times growing up. "Excuse me," Michael said to his crew, immediately changing direction. As he approached, he caught snippets of conversation. He heard his mother mention his name, followed by the flight attendant's dismissive response. Years of professional training kept his expression neutral, but inside, a protective anger flared. He recognized the situation immediately. He'd seen his mother face similar treatment throughout his life. Walking up behind his mother, he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Mom, is everything all right here?" The change in the flight attendant's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. Her expression transformed from barely concealed impatience to shocked recognition as she connected the dots between Captain Johnson and Eleanor Johnson. Michael watched this realization unfold, keeping his face professionally pleasant despite his rising irritation. After the initial confrontation and Eleanor's quietly powerful words to Melissa, Tom began wheeling her toward the jetway. Michael walked alongside them, his captain's presence causing passengers and Essie Taft to move respectfully out of their way. "You didn't have to come find me," Eleanor said softly to her son. "I would have managed." Michael smiled down at his mother. "I know you would have, Mom. You always do. But that doesn't mean you should have to." As they approached the aircraft door, the customer service manager for the airline hurried up to them, slightly out of breath. Her name tag read Patricia Wilson, and her expression was one of professional concern. "Captain Johnson," she said, nodding respectfully. "I've just been informed about the situation with your mother. I want to personally apologize for any inconvenience." Michael maintained his professional demeanor. "Thank you, Ms. Wilson. I appreciate your concern." Patricia turned to Eleanor. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm deeply sorry for the confusion with your wheelchair assistance. I'll be personally overseeing your boarding and making sure you're comfortable." Eleanor looked at the woman thoughtfully. "Thank you, dear. But I'm more concerned about other passengers who might face similar situations without having a son who's the captain." Patricia nodded, having the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "You're absolutely right. This shouldn't happen to anyone regardless of their connections. I assure you we'll be addressing this." By now they had reached the aircraft door. Tom carefully helped Eleanor stand from the wheelchair, and Michael took her arm to steady her as she stepped onto the plane. The interior was quiet and cool, not yet filled with the bustle of boarding passengers. "First class is to the right, Mrs. Johnson," Patricia said. "Would you like me to help you get settled?" "I can take it from here," Michael said. "Thank you." As Patricia and Tom departed, Michael slowly walked his mother to her seat in the first row. He carefully helped her sit down, stowing her cane in the overhead compartment. "How's the hip today?" he asked quietly, kneeling beside her seat. Eleanor sighed, protesting a bit after standing so long, "But it'll be fine." Michael frowned. "You shouldn't have had to stand at all. That's why I arranged the assistance." "Don't look so worried." Eleanor patted his hand. "I've dealt with worse in my day. Much worse." Michael nodded, knowing the truth of her words. His mother had lived through segregation, had been among the first black teachers in her district, had raised him alone after his father died. She had navigated a world that often made simple things unnecessarily difficult. "That doesn't make it right, Mom." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." The aircraft was still relatively empty, giving them a rare moment of privacy. Michael sat in the seat beside his mother, temporarily abandoning his pre-flight duties. "Do you remember when I was about 10, he said, "and we took that bus trip to visit Aunt Ruby in Detroit?" Eleanor nodded. "Of course I do. The bus driver wouldn't let us sit in the front, even though those were the only empty seats. You didn't argue or make a scene. You just looked him in the eye and said, 'My son and I will be sitting down now,' and walked past him." Eleanor smiled at the memory. He was so surprised he didn't know what to do. "You taught me something important that day," Michael continued, "about standing up for yourself with dignity, about not letting other people's problems become your problem." "I had to teach you those things," Eleanor said, her voice softening. The world wasn't going to do it. The sound of the boarding announcement came over the aircraft speakers. Michael knew he needed to return to his duties, but he lingered a moment longer. "That flight attendant," he said. "Melissa, what do you think should happen?" Eleanor considered the question seriously, as she did all questions. Nothing drastic. She needs education, not punishment. People don't learn from being shamed. They learn from understanding. Michael squeezed his mother's hand. That's why you were such a good teacher for all those years. Speaking of teaching, Eleanor said, shouldn't you be in the cockpit preparing to fly this plane instead of fussing over me? Michael chuckled. Yes, ma'am. He stood up, straightening his uniform. Robert has everything under control, but you're right. Duty calls. As he turned to leave, Eleanor caught his hand. Michael, that young woman, Melissa, when you see her, be kind, firm but kind. She's young and she has a lot to learn. Michael looked down at his mother. This remarkable woman who had taught him everything important about life, about dignity, about treating people right. Even now, after being disrespected and ignored, she was thinking about the growth of the person who had wronged her. I will, Mom. I learned from the best after all. Eleanor smiled and settled back in her seat. Go fly your plane, Captain. Michael nodded and walked toward the cockpit, passing crew members preparing for boarding. As he approached the front galley, he saw Melissa standing rigidly, arranging welcome drinks with mechanical precision. Her face was flushed, her movements stiff. Ms. Winters, he said, his voice professional but not cold. Melissa turned, her expression a mixture of embarrassment and apprehension. Captain Johnson, Michael held up a hand. We have a flight to operate. Right now, our focus needs to be on ensuring all our passengers have a safe and comfortable journey to Seattle. After we land, I'd appreciate a few minutes of your time to discuss what happened today. Yes, sir, Melissa replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you, Michael said with a nod, then continued to the cockpit. As he settled into his captain's seat and began his final preparations, Michael thought about his mother sitting in first class. Throughout his life, she had shown him how to navigate a world that wasn't always fair, how to maintain dignity in difficult situations, and how to stand up for what was right without losing compassion for others. Those lessons had served him well as he rose through the ranks to become a captain. Today, once again, she was teaching by example, not just to him, but to everyone who had witnessed what happened at Gate 23. The revelation in the terminal lingered in the air like a heavy cloud. Melissa stood frozen, her hand still clutching the boarding pass she'd been about to scan. The line of waiting passengers had fallen unusually quiet, many pretending not to watch while stealing glances at the unfolding scene. The only sound was the gentle whirring of the wheelchair as Tom prepared to help Eleanor board the plane. Captain Johnson, Melissa finally managed, her voice barely audible over the terminal announcements. I didn't know that Mrs. Johnson was my mother, Michael finished for her, his tone professional but with an unmistakable edge of disappointment. Yes, as she mentioned to you earlier. Melissa swallowed hard. The clipboard in her hand suddenly felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Around her, other crew members had noticed the tension and were watching with varying degrees of discretion. Lisa, the head flight attendant, had started moving toward them, sensing something was amiss. I should get Mom settled, Michael said, nodding toward Tom, who was waiting patiently with Eleanor in the wheelchair. We can discuss this situation after we reach Seattle. Of course, Melissa replied, her cheeks burning with shame. I understand. As Michael turned to follow his mother, Melissa felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Lisa, her face a mixture of concern and confusion. What happened? Lisa whispered, watching as the captain and his mother disappeared down the jetway. Melissa couldn't bring herself to explain. How could she put into words what she had done? Or rather, what she hadn't done? How a simple request for assistance had somehow become a confrontation. How she had dismissed an elderly woman's claim that the pilot was her son, assuming it was just an attempt to get special treatment. I made a mistake, was all she could manage. The boarding process continued, with Lisa taking over Melissa's position at the gate. Melissa was assigned to welcome passengers on board, a task that normally allowed her to showcase her customer service skills. Today, though, she moved mechanically, her smile feeling plastic on her face as she directed passengers to their seats. She couldn't stop replaying the moment when Captain Johnson had appeared. The way Eleanor had looked at her son with such quiet dignity. The way the captain had remained composed and professional, even when Melissa could see the controlled anger in his eyes. Most of all, she couldn't forget Eleanor's parting words about common decency. When first-class boarding began, Melissa noticed how other flight attendants were giving Mrs. Johnson extra attention, offering pillows and blankets, making sure her seat was comfortable. It was the kind of service every passenger deserved, but Melissa knew it hadn't been offered to Eleanor when she needed assistance in the terminal. By the time general boarding was underway, the story had spread among the crew through whispered conversations and meaningful glances. Melissa felt increasingly isolated, aware that her actions reflected poorly not just on herself but on the entire airline. Patricia Wilson, the customer service manager who had rushed to apologize to the Johnsons, pulled Melissa aside briefly during a lull in boarding. "We'll need to have a discussion about this incident when we return," Patricia said, her voice low but firm. "This is not how we treat our passengers. Any of our passengers." Melissa nodded, unable to meet Patricia's eyes. "I understand." "Good. For now, focus on your duties. We have a plane to get in the air." As the final passengers boarded, Melissa found herself near Eleanor's seat while assisting someone with storing their luggage. She couldn't avoid making eye contact with the elderly woman, whose gaze was neither angry nor accusing, just thoughtful, observant. Melissa hesitated, then stepped closer. "Mrs. Johnson," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I want to apologize for—" "Not now, dear," Eleanor interrupted gently. "You have a job to do, and this isn't the time or place. We can talk later if you'd like." There was no condemnation in her tone, just a practical assessment of the situation. Melissa nodded and returned to her duties, struck by Eleanor's composure. Even after being treated poorly, this woman was still considering what was appropriate and professional. The boarding door closed and the safety briefing began. Melissa went through the motions automatically, demonstrating oxygen masks and seatbelts, while her mind remained stuck on the incident at the gate. As the plane pushed back from the terminal, she heard Captain Johnson's voice come over the intercom, welcoming passengers aboard and promising a smooth flight to Seattle. His voice betrayed nothing of what had happened earlier. He was the consummate professional, just as his mother had remained dignified and composed throughout their encounter. The parallel wasn't lost on Melissa. Once they reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt signs were turned off, the cabin crew began their service. Routine. Lisa assigned Melissa to the economy section, away from first class where Eleanor was seated. Melissa understood why and didn't protest. She went about her duties with mechanical efficiency, unable to fully engage with passengers as she normally would. During a quiet moment in the galley, Robert, the co-pilot, came back to grab a coffee. He nodded politely to Melissa but said nothing. As he stirred his coffee, however, he seemed to make a decision. "You know," he said quietly, "Captain Johnson is one of the most respected pilots in the company." Melissa looked up, uncertain how to respond. "He's been flying for over 20 years, Robert continued. "Never raises his voice, treats everyone with respect, from the CEO to the cleaning staff. His crews would walk through fire for him." "I didn't know," Melissa said, though that wasn't entirely true. She'd heard of Captain Johnson's reputation, but had never flown with him before today. His mother raised him alone after his father died. When he was 12, Robert added. She was a teacher for over 40 years. Apparently, she was quite remarkable herself. The information settled heavily on Melissa's shoulders. She hadn't just disrespected any passenger. She had disrespected someone who had dedicated her life to educating children, who had raised a son alone to become the kind of man others looked up to. "Why are you telling me this?" Melissa asked, though she already knew the answer. Robert considered his words carefully. "Because I think it matters who people are, not because of their connections or status, but because of their character. And because I think you're going to have a chance to make this right, and I hope you take it." He took his coffee and returned to the cockpit, leaving Melissa alone with her thoughts. The flight continued without incident. Clouds drifted past the windows, Passengers dozed or watched movies, and the hours ticked by. Melissa found herself watching Eleanor whenever she passed first class, noting how the elderly woman chatted warmly with other passengers, how she thanked crew members with genuine appreciation for every small service. As they began their descent into Seattle, Melissa realized she'd been avoiding what she needed to do. When they landed, she would need to face both Captain Johnson and his mother. The prospect filled her with dread, but also with a determination to take responsibility for her actions. The landing was smooth, just as Captain Johnson had promised. As passengers prepared to deplane, Melissa noticed Patricia approaching Eleanor with a wheelchair ready for her deplaning. The customer service manager was personally ensuring that the assistance Eleanor had requested would be provided this time. Melissa watched as Eleanor thanked Patricia, her manner gracious but not overly effusive. Then, unexpectedly, Eleanor looked directly at Melissa and beckoned her over. Heart-pounding, Melissa approached. "Yes, Mrs. Johnson? I believe my son wanted to speak with you after we landed," Eleanor said. "He mentioned meeting in the crew lounge in 30 minutes. I'll be there, as well, if that's all right with you." The request, or perhaps it was more of a directive, took Melissa by surprise. She had expected to be reprimanded by management, possibly even suspended. She hadn't expected to face both the captain and his mother in a conversation. "Of course," Melissa said, her throat dry. "I'll be there." Eleanor nodded, then added, "Don't look so worried, dear. This isn't an execution." The unexpected touch of humor caught Melissa off guard. Thank you, Mrs. Johnson." As Melissa watched Patricia wheel Eleanor toward the terminal, she felt something shift inside her. The dread was still there, but alongside it was something else. A recognition that this conversation might be less about punishment and more about understanding. For the first time since the incident at the gate, Melissa felt a small measure of hope. Whatever was coming in that crew lounge, she would face it honestly. She owed that much to Eleanor Johnson, a woman who had maintained her dignity even when others had failed to recognize it. The crew lounge at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport hummed with the usual post-flight activity. Pilots reviewed flight logs, flight attendants chatted about their next destinations, and ground crew members grabbed quick cups of coffee before their next assignments. Melissa stood just inside the entrance, her uniform still crisp despite the 5-hour flight, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her regulation handbag. 30 minutes had never passed so slowly. After helping with deplaning and completing her post-flight duties, she had walked to the lounge with leaden feet, rehearsing apologies in her mind, none of which seemed adequate. The weight of what had happened sat heavily on her shoulders. In a quiet corner of the lounge, she spotted them immediately. Captain Johnson sat across from his mother, both with cups of tea on the small table between them. They were talking quietly, Eleanor gesturing with her hands as she explained something, while Michael listened with complete attention. Even from a distance, their connection was visible. The way they leaned slightly toward each other, the similar tilt of their heads, the comfortable silence that fell between them. Melissa took a deep breath and crossed the room. Conversations quieted as she passed, making her wonder how many people had already heard about what happened in Chicago. In an industry built on reputations and relationships, word traveled fast. "Ms. Winters," Captain Johnson said, looking up as she approached. "Thank you for joining us. Please have a seat." His tone was professional but not cold, the same voice he used when addressing his crew. Melissa sat down, placing her handbag carefully on the floor beside her chair. "Would you like some tea?" Eleanor offered, gesturing to the pot on the table. "It's chamomile, good for settling nerves." The simple kindness nearly undid Melissa's composure. "Yes, thank you," she managed, watching as Eleanor poured her a cup with steady hands. "I want to apologize," Melissa began, the words tumbling out before she lost her courage. "What happened at O'Hare was inexcusable. I treated you disrespectfully, Mrs. Johnson, and I'm truly sorry." Eleanor took a sip of her tea, considering Melissa over the rim of her cup. "I appreciate your apology, but I'm curious. What exactly are you apologizing for?" The question caught Melissa off guard. She had expected acceptance of her apology, or perhaps rejection, but not this gentle probing. For not getting you the wheelchair assistance you needed, she said, then paused. For doubting you when you said Captain Johnson was your son. For dismissing your concerns. Eleanor nodded, her eyes kind but unwavering. And why do you think that happened? Melissa felt heat rising in her cheeks. This wasn't a simple acceptance of an apology. Eleanor was pushing her to examine her actions more deeply. She glanced at Captain Johnson, who was watching quietly, his expression unreadable. I made assumptions, Melissa admitted, her voice small. I didn't prioritize your needs as I should have. What kind of assumptions? Eleanor pressed, not unkindly, but with the persistence of someone who had spent decades guiding young minds toward understanding. The moment stretched between them. Melissa looked down at her hands, then back up at Eleanor's face, at the lines of wisdom around her eyes, at the gray hair styled simply but with dignity, at the patient expression of a woman who had likely faced similar situations countless times before. I assumed you were exaggerating your need for assistance, Melissa said slowly, forcing herself to face the uncomfortable truth. I assumed you were making up a connection to the captain to get special treatment. And I think I saw an elderly black woman and made judgments I wouldn't have made about other passengers. The admission hung in the air. Melissa had never said anything like this aloud before, had never been forced to articulate the unconscious biases that had guided her actions. Thank you for your honesty, Eleanor said after a moment. That couldn't have been easy to say. Captain Johnson leaned forward slightly. Ms. Winters, I didn't ask you here to punish you or to make you uncomfortable. My mother and I wanted to have this conversation because what happened today matters beyond just this one incident. I understand, Melissa said, though she wasn't sure she did. Do you know what I taught for 43 years? Eleanor asked suddenly. Melissa shook her head. 3rd grade, Eleanor smiled. 8 and 9-year-olds. Do you know what happens at that age? Children are developing their understanding of fairness, of right and wrong, of how to treat others. It's when they start to absorb the biases and prejudices of the world around them. But it's also when they can learn to recognize and question those biases. She took another sip of her tea before continuing. I had a rule in my classroom. When a child made a mistake, especially one that hurt another child, they had to do 3 things. Acknowledge what they did wrong, understand why it was wrong, and make it right. Not just say sorry and move on, but truly make it right. Captain Johnson smiled at his mother. I was on the receiving end of that lesson more than once growing up. Eleanor chuckled. You certainly were. But it served you well, didn't it? It did, he agreed. And it's something I've carried into my role as captain. When mistakes happen, and they do, we're all human. What matters is how we respond to them. Melissa found herself nodding. I want to make this right, she said. I just don't know how. Eleanor's expression softened. That's a good place to start. The airline will have its own process for addressing what happened, Captain Johnson explained. Patricia has already filed a report and there will likely be some form of official response. But my mother and I believe that real change doesn't come from punishment. It comes from understanding and growth. When I was teaching, Eleanor added, I found that my students learned the most valuable lessons when they had to figure out for themselves how to make things right. So I'm going to ask you, what do you think would make this situation right? Melissa thought carefully. She had expected to be told what her punishment would be. Perhaps a suspension, a mark on her record, or even termination. Being asked to determine her own path forward was unexpected and in some ways more challenging. I think I need to learn more, she said finally. About how my assumptions affect how I treat passengers. About how to recognize when I'm not providing the same level of service to everyone. She paused. And I think I need to make sure what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else. Eleanor nodded, a teacher recognizing a thoughtful answer. That sounds like a good place to start. There's a training program, Melissa continued, the idea forming as she spoke. It's optional, about recognizing unconscious bias in customer service. I've always meant to sign up but never made the time. I could start there. And maybe I could work with passenger assistance more often to better understand the needs of passengers with mobility issues. Those are excellent suggestions, Captain Johnson said. Would you be willing to share what you learn with your colleagues? Not by telling them about this incident, but by helping create a culture where everyone receives the same high level of service? I would, Melissa said, feeling a sense of purpose replacing some of her shame. I could even help develop materials or scenarios for training based on what I learn. Eleanor smiled fully for the first time since they sat down. You see? Making it right isn't about punishment. It's about growth and change. It's about taking responsibility not just for what happened, but for making sure it doesn't happen again. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes. They talked about Eleanor's years of teaching, about Captain Johnson's path to becoming a pilot, about Melissa's 6 years as a flight attendant. The tension gradually eased, though Melissa knew she shouldn't, forget the lessons of this day. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor carefully stood up, leaning lightly on her cane. You know, she said to Melissa, in 43 years of teaching, I found that the students who made the biggest mistakes often became the strongest advocates for doing better. It wasn't despite their mistakes, but because of them, because they had faced something in themselves that needed changing. Melissa felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me. You didn't have to do that. No, I didn't, Eleanor agreed. But change doesn't happen in silence. It happens through conversation, through understanding, through people being willing to be uncomfortable for a little while so things can get better. Captain Johnson helped his mother with her coat. I need to get Mom settled at my place, but we'll be in touch about those training materials you mentioned. I think there's an opportunity here that goes beyond just one incident or one airline. Adi. Like that, Melissa said, and meant it. As she watched them leave the lounge, the tall, distinguished captain and his elegant mother, Melissa felt something shift inside her. The shame was still there, but alongside it was something new, a determination to learn, to change, to make things right, not just for Eleanor Johnson, but for all the passengers who would come after her. 3 months later, Melissa stood before a group of new flight attendants during their training, sharing what she had learned. On the screen behind her was a simple quote from Eleanor Johnson, words that had become a guiding principle not just for Melissa, but for the airline's new approach to passenger assistance. Dignity isn't something earned through status or connection. It's the right of every person who walks through our doors. Eleanor, watching the training video from Michael's living room in Seattle, smiled with quiet satisfaction. This was how change happened. One person, one conversation, one moment of honest reflection at a time.